we put a title to it in our mind, we've jumped to the end of the story because we know it so well, and we miss, to use your references, some of the brilliant exaggerations, some of the humor, the comedy. What do you suggest, because you also, as a parishioner and a leader in a parish, help people listen to the Word, what do you recommend for those of us who sit or stand hearing a proclamation and kind of deductively go to the end of the story and miss all of it? Any practical thoughts? So,
aside from my friend and bringing in 3 pages of the notes on the week's reading stuff, well, I mean, one thing that Father Jim Laughlin, who's our pastor, does, he has a flair for drama. And so in whatever text he chooses to comment on in his homily, especially if it's very dramatic, he will have presented parts of it as part of the homily, so that sort of clues people. And I really think that's the kind of response. And sometimes the homily is about something else. It isn't always about that. But if it's about text, then the homilist needs to pick up. You can't pick up all the details. A homily is not a lecture, but you can pick up on something that is dramatic, that's a twist, and that in itself gets people to maybe go back and look or think about the story differently. I mean, that's the only way to sort of do it in terms of the larger assembly. Obviously, in terms of the other readings, one has to take attention to how one reads so that they're read clearly. But yeah, the checkout, the kid next to you, well, she made her first communion. She's gotten a lot better than a kid who sits in the pew when I'm not doing anything official. She's not coloring anymore. But, there's the coloring and Cheerios in the train crowd. But that's really what you need. You sort of have to remind people of something that they've heard. And then people will be surprised. It's not at all unusual that people at the coffee hour or the parking lot on the way out of church are like, it's almost like they never heard that story before. And I can't remember, there was one recently, and I'm sort of looking at the lady, I'm going like, well, we read it every 3 years. I think she really thought we had somehow put a new story in. I wish I could.
Some others, please.
Because I live off Cape and I'm down here, I go to a lot of different parishes for various reasons, and I seem to see an attempt by priests to link all 3 of the readings, the 2, readings and the gospel, and they don't seem to focus as much on, a substantive piece like the gospel. Is that your experience, or do you comment on that? Very often the readings don't link anyway, or sometimes very awkwardly. Sometimes that happens. Though I also think sometimes people, you don't always have to preach on the gospel. A few Sundays ago when we had our friend Elijah, anointing Elisha, and half of the great Elijah story was left out, but so Father Jim just told basically the whole story and talked about that story. So he's very good. Of course, he gets a certain amount of encouragement, not to mention his weekly Bible notes, but, about using different readings, depending. So I think the effort of trying, given that it's very different when I preach at a Protestant church and I have 20 minutes or something, but given the amount of time we have for a homily within our liturgical context, I think it actually helps, and that's entirely up to whatever the homilist wants to do, to focus on one or another. Sometimes there's a connection. Sometimes the first reading is there because it mentions something in the second. But very often, the best link to the gospel, they don't bother to put in because they chopped out where it belongs. I mean, it drives me nuts.
I've always had difficulty reconciling the young man called upon to give up all his riches and the young man called upon to give up all of his riches and to follow Jesus, and that was the only way he could do it, versus thinking about the Good Samaritan, as you were talking about him, also a rich man, and just gave up some of his silver coins. And we kind of feel good about that. He's doing his job, but he didn't give it all up. And is it eventually he's going to have to, or is he going to just go along as he is in the world that he lived in at the time?
Luke actually has both. So Luke's solution to the issue is to have neither one, it's not like there's a law of one or the other. There are those people who, like Jesus' disciples, who gave it all up to follow him, and other people in the story, and people like the Good Samaritan, or the first penance guy, namely Zacchaeus, the tree climber, who he gives up a chunk. He does restitution for the wrong he's done, but he's not, giving it all up. And then the other issue about the young man, the rich young man that you referred to, that story, he was dissatisfied. He came to Jesus because he was dissatisfied. That's a little different. And I know people, I have friends, one of my very good Jesuit friends, who up to his 30s was doing great out in the West Coast in financial things as an economist and stuff, ditched all of that, been in East Africa, been in various places. He's out frying in Fresno right now. But the young man was dissatisfied, and he came to Jesus because he was dissatisfied, and Jesus said, I can make you whole. I can give you what your heart desires. And he invites him to become one. He looks on him with love and invites him to follow him. And at that point, he fails. So that's a little different than just saying there's a blanket rule that everybody has to do this.
The Samaritan is not dissatisfied.
No.
No, he's not.
I had heard or believed for a long time something you mentioned before, which is that Luke tells the stories of women more than the other gospel writers do. And I've also heard recently that some studies of these parts that have been chopped out of the lectionary sort of disproportionately remove some of those stories from what we hear in the Mass. So, can you comment on those two things?
I don't know whether they disproportionately remove them as an agenda item, because some of them are still there. What one would like, there are a lot of things biblical scholars would like, and believe me, we have gotten nowhere. We just like a decent translation of the Psalms. We're not fussy. And we've gotten absolutely nowhere. We're going to get a crummy new one, unfortunately. And believe me, there's been a huge amount of efforts. So, my reaction is, of course, I'd like them to include more. I don't think there's an agenda to chop out, but to include more, both from what you select, from both the Hebrew Bible and from the Gospels and other passages, so that people understand how much is really there. But I don't think it was a deliberate chopping out to avoid it. It was just you took things that were sort of traditional, and people didn't realize the importance of some of the stuff. But they're not going to let me revise the lectionary anytime soon, I can guarantee you.
I guess this question is more historical interest. First of all, two questions. One, who was Luke? What was his background? Some say he was, a physician? And what do we know about Luke himself?